I was 15 when I learned that in my father's eyes, I would always be guilty, no matter what. It started with a lie. I had just walked in from school, still shaking the cold off my jacket, when my dad's voice cut through the house. "You need to apologize to Mrs. Langley." I barely had time to process the words. For what? His arms were crossed, his stance firm, unmoving, unyielding. For vandalizing her fence. I let out a breath, half laughing in disbelief. What? Mrs. Langley, our next-door neighbor, had been complaining about teenagers messing with her property for months. Broken garden lights, missing decorations, small stuff, but enough to make her paranoid. But this was different. Someone had spray-painted ugly, jagged red lines all over her white wooden fence, like some kind of angry, mindless attack. And now, apparently, I was the one to blame. "Dad, I didn't do it," I said, shaking my head. His expression didn't change. "She saw you." I scoffed. "She's lying. Or mistaken. I wasn't even near her house yesterday." From the corner of my eye, I saw my mom standing behind him, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to disappear. She looked at me, then at the floor. But she didn't say anything. That made my stomach drop. Dad's jaw tightened. "Then why did she describe you?" I forced myself to stay calm. "How did she describe me?" His nostrils flared. "A boy your height, wearing a hoodie. Sound familiar?" I stared at him in disbelief. "Dad, half the kids at my school wear hoodies." "You were out with your friends last night," he countered. "Yeah." I nodded quickly. "At the convenience store. Ask Liam or Jake. They were with me the whole time." But I could already see it in his face. It didn't matter. He had already decided I was guilty. "You're going over there," he said, his voice final. "And you're going to apologize." I looked at Mom, pleading with my eyes, hoping she would step in, hoping she would at least suggest hearing me out. She hesitated. For a split second, I saw doubt flicker across her face. But then she sighed and turned away. That hit me harder than anything Dad had said. It wasn't about what I did or didn't do. It was about obedience. And in my dad's world, obedience mattered more than justice. The walk next door felt like a death march. Mrs. Langley opened her door before I could even knock. She was a small woman in her late 60s, all sharp edges and pursed lips. She looked me up and down with narrowed eyes, like she was examining something she found in the trash. "Well," she snapped. My face burned. My throat tightened. I had never apologized for something I didn't do before. It felt like swallowing broken glass. "I'm sorry," she scoffed. "Sorry doesn't fix my damn fence." I swallowed hard. My hands balled into fists at my sides. "I didn't do it," I mumbled under my breath. Her eyes darkened. "What was that?" I bit my tongue and shook my head. "Nothing." She eyed me for a moment, then huffed. "Kids these days. No respect." And then, just like that, she slammed the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, my blood boiling. When I turned to walk back home, I saw Dad watching me from the porch, arms still crossed. I knew what he wanted. He wanted me to take this as a lesson. He wanted me to learn that fighting back wasn't worth it. That when he made up his mind about something, my side of the story didn't matter. That was the moment something inside me shifted. It was small at first, a tiny, burning ember in my chest. Resentment. I didn't know it yet, but that ember was going to grow into a wildfire. That was the day I decided. If my dad wanted to treat me like I was guilty no matter what, then maybe, just maybe, I'd give him a reason to regret it. It wasn't just this moment that made me snap. It was years of being treated like a criminal in my own home. Years of being blamed for things I didn't do. When my older brother, Nathan, broke Mom's favorite vase, I was the one who got punished because I should have been more careful. When the kitchen window got shattered by a stray baseball, I was the one grounded, even though I was at school when it happened. And Nathan? He got away with everything. Dad worshipped him. The golden child, the straight-A athlete, the one who could do no wrong. Me? I was the screw-up, the disappointment, the one who always had to prove himself. And no matter what I did, it was never enough. But this was the final straw. When I stepped back into the house, Dad barely looked at me. "Good," he said. "Now let's not have this conversation again." And just like that, it was over. For him, at least. But for me, it was just beginning. I didn't say a word to my dad for the rest of the night. I ate dinner in silence, barely touching my food, while he acted like nothing had happened. Mom tried to make small talk, but I wasn't interested in pretending everything was fine. My mind was racing with the same thoughts over and over again. the unfairness of it all, the realization that it didn't matter what I said or did because my father would always believe what he wanted to believe. The feeling sat in my chest like a weight, pressing down on me, making it hard to even look at him. After dinner, I went straight to my room and shut the door, not slamming it because I knew that would only give him a reason to call me disrespectful, but closing it firmly enough that he'd know I didn't want to be bothered. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment in my head when he stood there watching me apologize for something I didn't do, his arms crossed, waiting for me to obey without question. I thought about all the other times I had been blamed for things that weren't my fault, all the times I had been punished just because it was easier for him to assume I was guilty. Nathan had never been forced to apologize for anything. He was the one who could do no wrong, the one my dad was proud of, the one he actually listened to. I had never been given the benefit of the doubt, not even once, not even when I had proof that I wasn't the one responsible for whatever had gone wrong. He had made his decision before I even walked through the door, and that made my stomach turn because if he didn't believe me about this, then he never would. The next morning, I woke up with my mind set on something I had never seriously considered before, getting even. I had spent years trying to be the good son, the one who didn't cause problems, the one who tried to be responsible, but for what? To be treated like this? If he was going to see me as a problem no matter what I did, then maybe it was time to stop trying so hard to be something he was never going to appreciate. At school, I told Liam and Jake what had happened, and they both reacted the way I had hoped they would, with disbelief and frustration on my behalf. Liam immediately started listing all the reasons why it was ridiculous for my dad to believe Mrs. Langley, pointing out how she had been accusing random kids of messing with her yard for months, but none of that mattered now. I had already done what my dad wanted. I had apologized. I had been humiliated, and now I was expected to just move on. But I wasn't going to move on, not this time. That night, I made my decision. I wasn't going to do anything reckless, nothing that could get me into serious trouble, but I was done playing by my father's rules. If he was going to treat me like a delinquent, then maybe I'd start acting like one, just enough to make him realize how wrong he had been to push me into that box. I started with small things, things he couldn't immediately get mad about but would notice. I ignored him when he spoke to me, not outright disrespecting him, but making it clear I had no interest in whatever he had to say. When he asked me to do something, I took my time, moving slower than necessary, not refusing but making it obvious I wasn't going to jump at his command like I used to. I stayed out later than usual, never late enough to break curfew, but just enough to make him uncomfortable, enough to make him wonder where I was and who I was with. I could see the irritation building in his face every time I acted indifferent to him, every time I failed to respond the way he expected, and it was the first time in my life that I felt like I had any power in our relationship. Then I started doing things that I knew would make him second-guess himself. I started spending more time outside, always in view of Mrs. Langley's house, never doing anything wrong but making sure she saw me, making sure she knew I wasn't afraid of her ridiculous accusations. I made sure I was seen talking to other neighbors, making conversation with people who knew I had nothing to do with what happened to her fence. I wanted people to start questioning her, to make her rethink what she had said, because if she was wrong about me, then maybe she had been wrong about the other things she had complained about too. And then, finally, I did the one thing I knew would get under my dad's skin more than anything else. I started acting like Nathan. I mimicked the way he talked, the way he shrugged things off, the way he carried himself like he was untouchable. I started answering questions the way Nathan would, with short, confident statements instead of explanations. I made sure my dad saw me laughing at my phone at texts I wouldn't share, saw me coming home with a look on my face that suggested I had been up to something even when I hadn't. I wanted him to start doubting himself, to wonder if he had been wrong about me all along, if maybe, just maybe, his insistence on treating me like a liar had created something he wasn't prepared to handle. It didn't take long for the tension in the house to reach a breaking point. My dad started watching me more closely, his eyes following me when I walked past him, his tone sharper when he asked me what I had been doing. He never came out and accused me of anything. Not yet, but I could see the way his mind was working, the way he was trying to figure out if something had changed or if he had just never noticed before. My mom, on the other hand, had started to get nervous. She would try to smooth things over when my dad got irritated, try to bring up neutral topics at dinner to cut through the thick silence, but it was too late for that now. One night, after I came home from hanging out with Liam and Jake, my dad was already waiting for me in the living room. He had his arms crossed, the same way he had stood when he made me apologize to Mrs. Langley. But this time, there was something else in his expression, something uncertain. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice firm but lacking the usual confidence. I shrugged, kicking off my shoes. Out. Out where? Just around. He inhaled slowly through his nose, his patience thinning. "You're acting different." I looked at him for a long moment before replying, choosing my words carefully. "Am I?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "You are." I smiled, not a big grin, just enough to let him know I wasn't afraid of him. Maybe I'm just tired of trying so hard. For the first time in my life, I saw something in his expression that I had never seen before. Doubt. My father didn't respond right away, but I could tell from the way his jaw tensed that my words had landed exactly how I wanted them to. I didn't wait for him to say anything else before walking past him, heading to my room without bothering to turn around. He didn't call after me, didn't stop me, but I could feel his gaze on my back, watching me as I left. I shut my door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and tension. I had never spoken to him like that before, never let him know so clearly that I wasn't interested in earning his approval anymore, and the realization that I had unsettled him made my chest tighten with something I couldn't quite define. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was something close. The next few days at home felt different. My mother was more on edge, watching my father carefully as if waiting for him to explode. He didn't, but I could see the way his mood had shifted. He was more irritable, his patience thinner, and even though he hadn't outright accused me of anything, I could tell he was trying to figure out if I had done something he didn't know about. He started coming home from work earlier than usual, making his presence known around the house in a way that felt deliberate, as if he was waiting to catch me in the act of something. I made sure to never give him a reason, but I also didn't go out of my way to ease his suspicions. I wanted him to wonder, to feel the same uncertainty that I had felt every time he had looked at me and assumed the worst. One afternoon, while I was in the kitchen grabbing a snack, my mother finally said something. She had been quiet about everything up until that point, keeping her distance from whatever was happening between my father and me, but I could see that she was starting to crack under the tension. She stood by the sink, drying a plate even though it was already dry, her movements slow and deliberate like she was trying to buy herself time before speaking. I ignored her at first, opening the fridge and pretending I didn't notice the way she kept glancing at me. But when she finally cleared her throat and turned toward me, I knew she wasn't going to let it go. "I don't know what's going on between you and your father," she said, her voice calm but heavy, "but it needs to stop." I grabbed a bottle of water and twisted the cap off, taking a sip before answering. "I don't know what you're talking about." She sighed, setting the plate down on the counter. "Don't do that. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You've been acting different, and so has he. This house feels like a war zone, and I'm sick of it." I took another sip, not rushing to respond. "Maybe you should talk to him about that." Her lips pressed together in frustration. "I'm talking to you because you're the one pushing this. I've known your father for a long time, and I know how he is, but I also know you. You're doing this on purpose." I finally turned to face her, my grip tightening around the bottle. He forced me to apologize for something I didn't do. He didn't even try to listen to me. I could have had 100 alibis, and it wouldn't have mattered. He had already made up his mind, just like he always does. Her eyes flickered with something close to guilt, but she didn't deny it. "I know it wasn't fair, but this isn't the way to handle it. You're only making things worse." I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. "Making things worse for who? Him? You? Because it's already been worse for me for years. The difference is now I'm not just sitting there and taking it." She rubbed her forehead, exhaling slowly. "I'm not saying what he did was right. I'm saying that if you keep this up, it's going to escalate into something you won't be able to control." I stared at her, searching her face for some sign that she actually understood what she was asking me to do. "So what? I'm supposed to just drop it? Pretend it never happened? Let him keep treating me like this?" She hesitated, and that moment of silence told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't asking for a resolution. She was asking for peace, for things to go back to normal, because that was easier than dealing with the mess that had been created. I set the water bottle down on the counter with a little more force than necessary. If he wants things to be normal, then maybe he should be the one to fix it. I left the kitchen before she could say anything else. That night, my father finally snapped. I had been in my room, scrolling through my phone when I heard his footsteps coming down the hall, slower than usual, like he was trying to decide if he was really going to do what he was about to do. My door opened without a knock, and I looked up to see him standing there, his expression unreadable, but his posture stiff, his hands clenched at his sides. "We need to talk," he said, his voice measured. I didn't move from where I was sitting. "About what?" His fingers twitched slightly, a sign that he was trying to keep himself under control. "You know what?" I set my phone down on the nightstand and leaned back slightly. "No, I don't. Why don't you tell me?" His eyes narrowed. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but it's going to stop now. You've been acting like a smart-ass for weeks, pushing your luck, and I'm done with it." I tilted my head slightly, pretending to think. "So, let me get this straight. You forced me to apologize for something I didn't do, refused to listen to me, treated me like I was guilty before I even had a chance to defend myself, and now you're mad because I'm not acting the way you want me to? That about sum it up." His jaw tightened. "You don't get to twist this around. I don't know what's gotten into you, but this stops now." I let out a slow breath, keeping my expression calm even though my heart was pounding. "Or what?" His face hardened. "You really want to find out?" I held his stare, refusing to look away first. "Yeah, I do." The silence between us stretched, thick and heavy, neither of us willing to back down. He had always been the one with the control, the one who dictated how things went, but now, for the first time, he was realizing that I wasn't going to just take it anymore. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the flicker of doubt that hadn't been there before, and I knew that no matter what happened next, I had already won something. He exhaled sharply and shook his head. "Get your act together." He turned and walked out of my room, shutting the door harder than necessary. I sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the closed door, feeling the shift that had just taken place. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. For the next few days, the house felt even heavier than before. My mother had stopped trying to mediate between my father and me, sensing that whatever was happening was beyond her control. She no longer asked me to fix things, no longer sighed in frustration when my father and I ignored each other at the dinner table. She just sat there, eating in silence, waiting for the inevitable explosion that we all knew was coming. My father wasn't speaking to me unless it was absolutely necessary, and when he did, his tone was clipped, his words short and final. He didn't ask where I was going when I left the house, didn't demand to know when I'd be home, but I could tell he was keeping track of me in his own way, watching for the moment I would slip up, for the moment he could justify whatever punishment he had in mind. I had spent more time out of the house than usual, not because I had anywhere important to be, but because I knew it would bother him. Liam and Jake had noticed the change in me, had picked up on the way I carried myself differently, the way I no longer seemed interested in making things easier for the people around me. They never said it outright, but I could tell they weren't sure if they liked this version of me. They didn't understand what it felt like to be constantly doubted, constantly treated like an inconvenience, and I wasn't about to explain it to them. I wasn't looking for approval, wasn't waiting for someone to tell me I was justified. I had spent my whole life trying to prove myself, and I was done playing that game. One evening, just as I was getting ready to head out, my father stepped into the hallway, blocking my way. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, waiting for me to acknowledge him. I didn't. I moved to step around him, but he shifted slightly, making it clear he wasn't going to let me pass without a conversation. "Where are you going?" His voice was even, but there was something in it that suggested he wasn't as calm as he wanted to seem. "Out." "With who? Does it matter?" His jaw tightened. "It does when you've been acting like this." I let out a slow breath, keeping my expression neutral. "Acting like what?" "You know exactly what I mean." His eyes were locked onto mine, daring me to challenge him, to keep pushing like I had been for weeks. "You think you're proving something by doing this? By acting like you don't care about anything? You think it makes you look strong?" I met his stare without hesitation. "I don't think anything. I just don't see the point in trying anymore." His nostrils flared slightly, the only visible sign that my words had hit the mark. "So that's it. You're just giving up." I tilted my head slightly, pretending to consider his words. "I'm doing exactly what you always expected me to do. Why does that bother you so much?" His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he didn't move, didn't raise his voice. "You're still a kid. You don't get to decide how this goes." I smiled, not out of amusement, but because, for the first time, I saw the frustration in his face, the realization that I wasn't going to bend the way he wanted me to. I think I already have. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if trying to shake off whatever anger was building inside him. You think you're being smart, but all you're doing is making things worse for yourself. You can't win this. I stepped back slightly, making it clear that I was done with the conversation. I'm not trying to win anything. I just don't care anymore. I brushed past him, ignoring the way his body tensed as I moved by. He didn't stop me, didn't reach out or grab my arm, but I could feel the weight of his stare as I walked out the door. The air outside was cool against my skin, a stark contrast to the heat that had built up inside me during that exchange. I didn't know where I was going, didn't have a plan beyond getting away from the house, from the tension that had made it impossible to breathe. I walked without thinking, letting my feet take me wherever they wanted, my thoughts running in circles around everything that had happened. I didn't realize where I had ended up until I saw the familiar fence in front of me, the same one I had been accused of vandalizing. The red spray paint had been scrubbed off, but faint stains still lingered where the wood had absorbed the color. I stared at it for a long time, my mind flickering back to the humiliation of standing on that doorstep, forced to apologize for something I hadn't done. The anger that had settled in my chest weeks ago reignited, burning hotter than before, because no matter what I did, no matter how much I proved that I wasn't the person my father had decided I was, it was never going to be enough. The door opened before I could turn away. Mrs. Langley stood there, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took me in. "What do you want?" Her voice was as clipped as ever, suspicious even though I was just standing there. I considered walking away, letting her think whatever she wanted, but something in me refused to leave without saying what I had been holding back for weeks. "You were wrong," I said, my voice steady. Her brows furrowed. "Excuse me. You were wrong about me," I repeated, taking a step closer. "I didn't do it. I never did." She scoffed, shaking her head. "I saw you." "No, you didn't," I said, my tone calm but firm. "You saw what you wanted to see. And now you're going to pretend that doesn't matter, because admitting you were wrong is harder than sticking to your story." She didn't answer right away, but I could see the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the door. "Get off my property," she said finally, her voice quieter than before. I didn't move. "You don't care if I did it or not. You just wanted someone to blame. And my dad, he gave you exactly what you wanted." Her lips pressed into a thin line. I said, "Get off my property." I held her gaze for another moment before stepping back. I had known she wouldn't admit anything, had expected her to dig in her heels, but saying the words out loud felt like its own kind of victory. She could lie to herself all she wanted, but I had planted doubt in her mind, just like I had in my father's. I turned away and walked back toward the street, feeling a sense of finality settle over me. This wasn't over. Not yet, but it was getting closer. When I got home that night, my father was sitting in the living room, the TV on but the sound muted. He wasn't watching it. His eyes were on the doorway, waiting for me, his arms resting on his knees, fingers interlocked like he had been sitting there thinking for a long time. My mother wasn't in sight, and I knew that was deliberate. She had probably sensed that something was about to happen and decided it was better to stay out of it. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of asking what he wanted, so I walked past him, heading toward the stairs, but his voice stopped me before I could make it out of the room. "Sit down." I hesitated, considering ignoring him and going to my room, but something in his tone made it clear that wasn't an option. I turned slowly, making my way to the chair across from him, sitting back with my arms crossed, waiting for whatever lecture he had planned this time. He didn't speak right away, just looked at me like he was trying to figure something out, like he was seeing me for the first time and realizing that he didn't recognize who I had become. "You think you've made your point?" His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something uncertain. I tilted my head slightly, keeping my expression unreadable. "What point do you think I'm trying to make?" His jaw tensed, and I could tell that answer had irritated him. "I don't know what's going through your head, but this little act of yours, this whatever it is, it ends now." I let out a breath through my nose, shaking my head slightly. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't an act. This is me deciding that I'm done trying to be the son you want me to be, because no matter what I do, you'll never see me the way you see Nathan. I'll always be the problem, always be the one you blame first. So why should I care what you think anymore?" For a second, just a second, I saw something flicker in his expression, something close to regret, but it disappeared just as quickly as it had come. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers tightening together. You don't get to rewrite history just because you're mad at me. I've never treated you unfairly. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You really believe that? He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. I've done everything I could to raise you right, to teach you responsibility, to make sure you grow up knowing the difference between right and wrong. And this attitude, this defiance, it's not making you look strong. It's making you look weak. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm, because I wasn't going to let him drag me into another argument where he twisted everything to make himself look like the reasonable one. No, what's weak is blaming your own son for something he didn't do because it was easier than actually looking for the truth. What's weak is never admitting when you're wrong, never once thinking that maybe, just maybe, the way you see things isn't always the way they actually are. What's weak is pretending that treating me like a criminal my entire life was just raising me right. His face darkened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to yell, thought he was going to explode the way he always did when he didn't have control of a situation. But instead, he just sat there, staring at me, his hands tightening around his knees like he was holding himself back. You're not a victim, he said finally, his voice quieter than before. I leaned forward, mirroring his posture. I never said I was. But I'm not your scapegoat either. The room was silent for what felt like forever, the air thick with everything that had been left unsaid for years. My father had always been the one who dictated how things went, who decided what was right and what was wrong. But now, for the first time, he was realizing that he had lost that power over me. He could tell me to sit down. He could tell me that things were going to go back to normal. But he couldn't force me to be the person I used to be. The person who cared what he thought, who tried to earn his approval. You're still my son, he said after a long moment, his voice quieter, almost like he wasn't sure if he believed his own words. I nodded slowly. Yeah, but that doesn't mean you know me. He looked away for the first time since we had started talking, his jaw tightening, his fingers flexing against his knees. There was something in his expression that I had never seen before, something I didn't know how to describe. He had always been so sure of himself, so certain that he was right about everything. But now, as he sat there in the dim light of the living room, I saw hesitation in his eyes, doubt in the way he held himself. He wasn't going to apologize, I knew that much. He wasn't the kind of man who admitted when he was wrong, but I didn't need an apology. Not anymore. I stood up, pushing the chair back slightly as I did. He didn't look at me, didn't try to stop me this time. I turned and walked toward the stairs, my steps slow, controlled. As I reached the top, I heard him let out a long breath, like he had been holding it in the whole time. I didn't turn around, didn't say anything else. I had said everything I needed to say. When I closed my bedroom door behind me, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. This wasn't over, not really. My father wasn't going to change overnight, and I wasn't naive enough to think that this one conversation had fixed everything. But something was different now. He knew that I wasn't afraid of him anymore, that I wasn't going to fight for his approval or let him push me into being someone I wasn't. He could hold on to his pride, could convince himself that he hadn't done anything wrong, but the doubt was there now, sitting in the back of his mind, making him question things he had never questioned before. And that was enough for me.